Welcome back. This is the Daily Wealth Junkie Show, and I am Brandon Dukeman here with Will Harvey, and we have another awesome guest here for you today. But first, before we get started, once again, don't forget, subscribe to the show so that you're not missing any of our daily episodes, and rate and leave us a comment so that we know how we're doing. Also, join us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/wealthjunkies. Now, Will, let's get this show started and who we have today.
Yep. Brandon, thank you. We have Mitch Russo on the show today. He is the author of Power Tribes. That's the second book that he's written, and former CEO of the Tony Robbins and Chet Holmes company called Business Breakthroughs International. And he's also done a little thing where he grew a company called Time Slips to $10 million in revenue, and then he sold it. So with that, Mitch, thank you so much for coming on the show. Can you just give the listeners a little bit more about your background and what got you to where you are today?
Sure, I will. And Brendan, thanks for inviting me. It's a delight to be here, and love your show. Looking to support it as it grows.
Thank you.
My pleasure. So let me give you a little bit of background, starting with my high school experience. So I was a small kid. I wasn't big like the other kids in school, so I never got invited to play basketball or football. So I had no real way of meeting girls. So I figured the best way to meet girls is to start a rock band. So
there you go. Rock it out.
That's what I did. And so my buddies and I got together, and individually we spent years taking guitar and drum and bass lessons until finally 3 years later, we were really ready to get playing and everything. So we got together in the basement and we had a great time. We, of course, smoked a little weed before to make it even better. But what we discovered after turning on the tape recorder is that every week after we play and we thought we sounded great, we played back the tape and it sounded like crap.
That's funny.
Partially because I have no talent, actually, and secondarily because, we just didn't work. And so we made some decisions and said, well, we really want to be a band and we really want to play. So let's be disciplined and let's decide that we're not going to get high during band practice, and actually work on songs. So now I'm about to share with you the 7 lessons I learned about being a CEO that I discovered while building a rock band in Brooklyn, New York.
While in high school. That's awesome.
So the second lesson was, and I alluded to it already, is don't deliver a substandard product. And the reason we came up with that as a lesson, because, we could have gone out sort of half-assed playing what we knew, but instead we spent weeks practicing one song. We wanted to deliver a good quality product, and we knew that was going to get us more gigs. So we focused in on the music. The third thing that we learned came about after we realized that we really only want to play classic rock. Now it wasn't called classic rock back then, It was just called rock.
Right.
But that's all we wanted to play. So when we started getting requests for dance music, we tried to learn a few dance music songs and we hated it. So lesson 3 comes from a famous American philosopher that you absolutely know who he is. I guarantee it. Have you ever heard of Colonel Sanders?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well,
Kentucky Fried Chicken.
You got it. But he said something very important that stuck with me all my life. He said, "We do chicken right." And what that meant to me is that we don't do hot dogs, we don't do hamburgers, we don't do pizza. We do chicken right. We focus. And that was lesson 3. We do chicken right. And it became an important lesson because when people came to us and asked us to do other types of music, we said, sorry, but that's not our thing. We do this. And that's what we played. The fourth thing that happened for us was that as we started getting better and better at our performances, we started raising our prices. So ideally what we wanted to do is figure out just how much people would pay. And remember, this is 1969, 1970. We started out at $50 a night for our band to play. And eventually we kept raising the price little at a time until we got to $500 a night. And
Wow.
that became a great lesson about price testing, which is lesson 4. Honestly assess your true worth and then begin pricing experiments to find your ideal price. And then finally, I had this idea, why don't we get a little note from whoever paid for the party, like the mom who hired us for their Sweet 16, and have her write a little testimonial for us. So
Mm-hmm.
I carried around a clipboard and a pencil, and I'd pull it out right at the end of the gig and say, hey, how'd we do? Would you mind jotting down a couple of words about how you liked us? And that was lesson 5. Get a testimonial after every service or product delivered. And then finally, the best lesson of all, the most fun lesson of all was that, have fun. And we did. We had a blast building this band, and eventually became the highest paid high school band in all of the area that we lived in. But you see, there's, as you know, well, there's a dark side to the story. The more and more I got involved in music in my band, the more and more drugs that we did. And eventually I became addicted to narcotics, to heroin in particular. And that unfortunately pretty much almost put a stop to my life completely. And it was a terrible time in my life, but I was able to overcome it.
That is wild. So what got you to, did it start kind of with weed and then just progress into worse and worse things?
Well, I mean, look, I just like getting high. I didn't effectively care how I was doing it at the time.
Yeah.
With not much, no brains in my head. I didn't really understand a lot of what now is so obvious to adults. As kids, I just didn't get it. And so I decided one day I just wanted to get high. So I went into the boys' room in high school, looked for the guy who was always around selling weed. He wasn't there, but there was another guy there selling dope.
Oh, wow.
So,
Dope
that's
is
crazy.
heroin for all you non-junkies out there. I'm talking about real junkies, not woke junkies.
Yeah, not the world junkies.
I'm a former. Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah. So there was a moment in time though when all of this changed for me, and it was I've been shooting now for, at that time, probably for about 6 months. I was addicted, and I had a habit, but the rock band money was coming through regularly, and so that helped pay for what was going into my arm every day.
Absolutely.
And so it was a Thursday, and I went into the bathroom, and there was my guy, and I bought a bag of dope, stuck it in my wallet, and I decided I wasn't going to use it until Saturday after band practice. So that little bag of dope sat in my wallet and burned a hole in my mind, because it's all I thought about until Saturday afternoon. I'm sure you can relate.
Oh, yeah.
And so came Saturday afternoon, the band, we had a great band practice. Everybody left. It was my quiet time alone in the house. So I pulled out my wallet. There was my beautiful little bag of dope. So I reached for my box, which had let's put it this way, my accessories in that box.
Yeah, right.
And, I took the spoon and I tapped some water in, and I tapped the dope in, and then I put my cotton ball in, and then I lit a match underneath the spoon to boil it. Then I drew it up into my syringe, and I tapped the syringe to make sure there was no air bubbles. And just as I was about to put it into my arm, after I tied it with the belt, the phone rang. So I put the needle down, I picked up the phone, and I said, hello. And all I could hear was click, 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 click. I said, hello, can you hear me? And I didn't think it was, like a bad line. I thought somebody was trying to call me.
Right.
So I kept saying hello until eventually I realized that there was no one there. And so I hung up. So I obviously at that point wanted to resume what I was doing before.
Absolutely.
So I picked up the needle and I gave it that one last press to get the final air bubbles out. And the needle had gelled solid. And what I realized at that moment in time is that I was basically sold counterfeit dope. And if I would have injected it into my arm while it was still hot, it would have killed me in 15 seconds.
That's insane.
So whoever it was that called that day, and I have a feeling you know who it was that called, he saved my life. And I threw the needle down. I started to cry, and I sobbed for 20 minutes as I realized that I had reached the crossroads of my life, that if I turned left, I would die a junkie probably in a couple of years or less.
Yeah.
Or if I turned right, I would be able to pull my life together and become a responsible adult and enjoy my life. And that's what I decided to do.
That is unbelievable. That's a sobering thing to just know that you were literally seconds away from imminent death. And to get that phone call, that's incredible. I don't know if you're a man of faith, if you believe in God, but wow, that's incredible.
Well, you know what? Whether I was or not at the time,
Yeah,
I,
right.
and I know who it was. It was definitely God who called,
Yeah.
and there was no other way to explain it. There was there was nobody on the other end of that phone, but yet there was enough going on to keep me on the phone so that the needle would gel and stop me from killing myself.
Unreal. So what did you do after that? Well, that was obviously the turning point. So how'd you get clean?
Well, at first, what I decided to do was I decided to stop using heroin completely, and I then went into withdrawal. And I white knuckled it through withdrawal, which means that I just tried to deal with it all by myself without anybody's help. And I went through a severe physical withdrawal over
Mhm.
the course of 3 or 4 weeks. And then another blessing, my mom came to me and said, look, I don't think you should hang around New York for the summer. So why don't we get you up to camp in the Catskills? We can get you a job as a waiter. And so I said, great. And so she got me a job as a waiter in a summer camp. And I said, well, just to be, sure that I'm going to have a good time, I'm going to bring this big bag of weed with me. So at least I can still get high, which I did. And so I was away for the summer. I did not have any exposure to heroin that entire summer. And I, for the most part, felt like I was doing great. But then I got a phone call from my mom the 6th week of camp. And that phone call came minutes after a buddy of mine just handed me a dime of hashish, which I promptly swallowed. So I just swallowed this big round ball of hash, and it was quite an experience because I didn't know what to expect. I'd never done that before, but now this phone call comes in, and my mom says to the camp director, "I need him home immediately, not in an hour, not. I just need him on a bus back to New York now." And so I tried to argue. I couldn't argue. The camp manager drove me to the bus station and put me on the bus. And that was it. I mean, I had no choice. I was on a bus going home. But I also had no idea um, what this hash was going to do to me. So I sat for this 4-hour bus ride. And for the most part, I didn't feel a thing.
Right.
I thought I was actually fine until I stood up. Once I got into New York, and I stood up and I realized that I was completely smashed. And
That I've eaten a weed brownie before, and the same thing happened. I was in class, and then just didn't realize how I felt until I stood up, and I was like, "Whoa!" So
yeah,
that's crazy.
yeah. So I got home and my mom confronted me and said, "What is this?" And I started to laugh. I was too stoned to care. And she said, "Okay, go to sleep. We'll talk in the morning." Bottom line is that, she had found my little box of goodies, and I made
Oh,
it. Yeah, it wasn't a good morning for me. And then proceeded to tell me that she's going to take me to see a psychiatrist in New York. So I waited till the Wednesday, and I had to stay in the house that entire time. And my buddies came over. We still smoked weed in the basement, but she didn't know that. And then we went over to this guy's place, and without realizing it, I was going to see this doctor, and turns out this was a drug rehab center. So he talked my mom into forcing me to stay there. Um, and recover. And so at first I was quite upset and angry. I felt like I was duped and tricked. But ultimately I realized that this might be just about the best thing I ever did. And so I stuck it out. And I learned a lot. I grew a lot in those 18 months. And I emerged clean and sober and motivated to get busy with life and turn my life into something to be proud of.
that's
Wow.
incredible.
So let's hear the good side. Let's hear where your
Yeah, that's
life
part
turned
one.
around and
Yeah.
and you started making all sorts of money and business moves and things like that.
Sure, sure. So what ended up happening is, like everybody else, I went and got a job, and that job was okay. But I know that in my heart, my passion revolved around electronics, And so I wanted to go to school for electronics. And so eventually I did. I went to school for electronics, and I started with a job that would have moved me out of New York and into Massachusetts. So I began working for a computer company, Data General. And after a little while, I was bored out of my brains because I had a very entry-level job. And somebody noticed and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You don't belong here. I can arrange an interview for you at our competitor, Digital Equipment Corporation." So I went over there, interviewed. They loved me and I loved them. And so they hired me, and I became a junior engineer working on some really cutting edge stuff at the time. And eventually they sponsored me to go to Northeastern University for my electrical engineering degree.
Wow. How old were you and what time frame was this?
Well, this was in 1975,
Okay.
76. So it was really about 78. I'm thinking back now that what I just described had happened. And I ended up getting picked up by a semiconductor company to become their regional applications engineer. And what that really meant is that I was to run around the countryside helping clients use the parts that we sold so that they can build, massive numbers of products with our parts in them.
Wow.
And that was fun. But what started to happen is I started to get jealous of the salesmen. I was making a lot of money for me at the time, but the sales guys were making 5 times what I was making. So I wanted to be a salesman.
Mm-hmm.
And so I approached my sales manager and said, "Hey, I want to work for you as a salesman." And he said to me at the time, he said, "Mitch," and these were the 3 words that drove my next decade of life. He says, "Mitch, great salesmen are born, not made. And unfortunately, you're not one of them." And
Wow.
I had 3 words go through my mind at that time. Those 3 words were, "I'll show you."
Absolutely.
And so I proceeded to train myself. I went to the Dale Carnegie Sales Institute and learned how to sell. I graduated at the top of my class, and I then proceeded to go out and get a sales job, which I did. I killed it at the sales job. I was, at the time, only 28, 27 years old, making $34,000 a month in commissions.
Wow.
Wow. That's a lot back then.
I just
That's a lot today.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I had saved a bunch of money, and I was fascinated with personal computers, always have been. So I decided that I wanted to leave my job in sales and build a company, some kind of a company. I had saved up enough money now. I had begun investing in real estate. I had 3 buildings in the city of Boston. And I knew that my future was not going to be in real estate. It was going to be in.
It just wasn't your passion.
It wasn't my passion at all. I mean, I made a lot of money
Yeah.
from it, but it just basically didn't excite me one bit.
Yeah. That's important.
Yeah. Yeah. So it turns out I had a neighbor move in next door. We met for breakfast. I shared with him some thoughts and ideas, and we came up with the idea for a software product. And the rest is history. We built a company called Time Slips Corporation, and it started literally in my garage with 2 guys. And 9 years later, we sold it for 8 figures and had over 100 people working for us.
No kidding.
So this was, you're late 20s, early 30s when you come up with that concept. Is that correct?
Yep, exactly.
So how did you get the sales experience? How did you build this into an 8-figure business?
Well, it's funny because if I would have known, and I'm sure you've heard this before, if I would have known how hard it would have been, I don't know I would have undertaken the action.
Right.
Good thing you didn't know.
Good thing I didn't know, because it was freaking hard. But you know why it was so hard? It was hard because I had no guidance. I was just a New Yorker, a kid out of New York with some street smarts, common sense, and sales training. And I really didn't know what to do or how to do anything, let alone lead a company of that size, let alone do it without much in the way of loans and venture capital or investment. Terrified of venture capital. I thought they'd steal the whole company, so I never looked into that.
You never
And
used any venture capital?
well, I did later, but not back
Okay.
then, because one time I had a conversation with a venture capital guy, and I said, "What do you think my company is worth?" And he quoted me a number that was way below what I was already generating in revenue.
Yeah, of
So I
course.
said, "Get the heck out of here! I don't want you don't ever get a chance to talk to
Yeah.
me again."
That's
Uh,
crazy.
yeah, and so what I started to do was make mistakes and recover for them as quickly as I could. We set aside, the two of us, my partner and I, set aside $10,000 in total. Um, and honestly, it was a waste of money completely. So we'd blown our entire marketing budget on 3 ads. And turns out that those ads didn't generate anything in terms of sales. We were selling our product for
Ouch.
$99. And we spent $12,000 on these 2 ads and generated $500 in revenue. So
Oof.
we were kind of confused and not sure what to do next. And the ad rep came to me, drove out to my place and said, "Hey, I'm real sorry about that. I know that was your last money. Oh, and by the way, here's this big pile of leads called bingo leads. Back then in magazines, they'd have a little card. And if you like a product, you would circle the number on the card. I'm sure you've seen some of those in the past." So that's what we did. So I took the bingo leads and I figured, look, I have nothing else to do. Let me call every single person. And I made another 60 sales by calling the bingo leads. But
Wow.
that wasn't the important part. The important part was that I started to understand who my ideal client really was. And what the mistake I had made is we had advertised in the general purpose PC magazine,
Mm-hmm.
whereas my real clients were lawyers and soon to be accountants as well.
So you're basically just advertising to anybody and everybody, not really sure, who your real target audience was until that time. And then you
That's
started
right.
to narrow it down, and then things became more clear.
Right. But since we had blown all our money, we had no real cash for ads again. So we started
Right.
running classified ads for $30 an ad and tracking the results and discovering which classifieds did the best. Until at one point, we were running probably 15 or 16 classified ads in the legal industry all throughout the country every single week. And we started to grow our sales that way. And then a miracle took place. I had gone to Comdex, which was the big computer trade show out in Las Vegas. It's not around anymore, but it used to be. And I had walked around for 10 days. I had 100 copies of my software with me. And I went from booth to find out if any of these companies would have any interest in promoting our software along with their products as well. And I came home hopeful but disappointed because I had not landed any deals. But now it was 6 months later and we get a phone call. It turns out that the lead interviewer at InfoWorld, which was the most influential computer publication at the time, was one of the people I gave a copy of review software, and he was calling to do a fact check before publishing our review. Now,
No
I know
kidding.
I know you guys have no idea what InfoWorld is or was at the time, but
Nope.
if let's put it this way, if they published a mediocre review of your software,
Mm-hmm.
you might as well close down. You might as well shut your doors.
Wow.
That's how influential they were. So we were shaking in our boots, wondering what was going to happen.
Yeah, I would be too.
And we didn't know when the review was coming out. They wouldn't tell us. But what we did know is that when it struck, something was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So it was about 3 weeks later, and it was about 5:30 in the morning, and I hear the phone ringing in our little office in the basement below. So in the garage below. So I run downstairs and I answer the phone. It says, "Yes, I'd like to buy a copy of time slips." And I was, "Yes, sir." And I pulled out my order form and I started writing. And then another phone is ringing, and another. We had 6 phones. We were optimistic that someday we might need 6 phones, but never had 2 of them rang at the same
Right.
time.
Wow.
And now
until that day.
until that day, now all 6 were ringing.
Wow.
And now we started to get calls from the big distributors who wanted to carry our products. So we went from selling 5 or 6 a week to 600 copies a month, all in a matter of one day.
Wow,
That's wild.
incredible.
So that was kind of the tipping point, was that publication and the review of your company.
Right. Which taught me a huge lesson. PR is the most valuable thing you could ever obtain if you do it right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's so
And
true. That's why Donald Trump became Donald Trump. You know, he
Yeah.
was so good at PR. Now that's what a cool story that is. So why did you ultimately end up wanting to sell, and can you just explain that?
Sure. Well, everything that we did was on a personal signature. Like I said, we weren't very sophisticated financially. We never realized that it was important to build business credit as well as personal credit. And so as the company was growing, and it was growing quite rapidly for a while, we were expanding the company very, very rapidly as well. And we needed to take a line of credit. We needed to take out a temporary loan as our cash flow ebbed and flowed. And typically it would ebb and flow around updates and new versions. So, sometimes, we started with the bank. The bank was kind enough to take a little risk on us and lent us $2,300 for a copying machine. But later, that same bank, 5-6 years later, was lending us $500,000 at a time, as our needs increased. And then we pay it back. We had one rule. The bank had one rule, which is you had to bring your credit line to zero at least for 5 minutes once a year. And we didn't think that'd be a problem because we had these amazing upgrades. And so every time we come up with an upgrade, millions would pour into the company.
Mm-hmm.
And so we didn't really think twice about doing that until our upgrade was really late. And then, at that point, it came the moment of truth. I had to call the bank and said, look, I just want to let you know we're not going to be able to take our line of credit down to zero because our update was late. And we had done a great job of building a relationship with our bankers, a great job. And so at that moment in time, I was waiting for the banker to say to me, look, we have to call in the loan. You know the rules. I fully expected that. Instead, the guy said, well, Mitch, we really believe in you and we believe in what you're doing. Let me arrange to increase your line of credit while you're making it through this difficult time. And I, of course, thanked him.
No kidding.
And,
So
and
the
that's
opposite
built
happened.
off of personal relationships and
That's
just good experience with the
Trust.
bank. And
Yep,
wow,
exactly,
that's
exactly.
awesome.
And that's what I did. And that became, for me, again, one of those business lessons that you can never forget, which is build a great relationship with your financial team inside and outside and make sure that you know what's going on. And by the way, anybody listening to the show who's running a business, you know this. You got to know your numbers cold. If you don't know your numbers, then you aren't bankable. So if a banker says to you, well, what is your expenses year on year and how did they relate to current revenue? And you say, let me get back to you on that. You're already out of the game.
Right.
So you got to know your numbers cold and you got to know them by heart and you got to understand them so you could work with them on the spot. So if someone says to you, ask you a question and then proposes a solution or a condition, you have to know how it's going to affect your company. So I became educated.
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to ask. If you didn't know, if you're the type of person who doesn't know their numbers and isn't a huge numbers person, do you educate yourself? Do you hire somebody that can do that explaining to the bank for you, or how does that work?
Well, the way it really works is that you get yourself a great CFO
Mm-hmm.
and you bring in a part-time CFO, which is what I did. He worked for us for 2 days a month. And those were actually 4 half days a month. And he was incredible and amazing at what he did. And so he helped me better understand my numbers best that I could. And between the two of us, we had a very clear picture of what was going on. And then I had a very clear picture, of course, as well. And then to answer your question, I left out a few details about my partner. So he was my next door neighbor. And, I didn't know him very well when we met, other than he was my next door neighbor.
Right.
But it turns out that he was an award-winning programmer and had 5 commercial products on the market. So I was pretty confident in choosing him as a partner. But one of the things I found out later is that he and his family had a huge sum of money from the 1800s. So they had a family office not too far away, and that family office did nothing but manage the family's money. And so they were worth somewhere in the range of $500 million, but I didn't know this. And what ended up happening is that, when people are raised in families where there's almost unlimited wealth, they have a difficult time with self-worth. And for my partner, I think growing up, he had a difficult time trying to figure out what value he had if nobody would ever pay him. I mean, he'd go to work and then ask for a paycheck and people would laugh at him, because, his family was so wealthy and everyone knew it. So what I gave him a chance, inadvertently, not realizing it, I gave him a chance to prove to himself and to everyone else really what his worth was. And so my fear was that one day he'd come to me and say, well, we've been rated the #1 product in the internet, in the industry. And, we've already been successful. I'm kind of done. But he never did that. What he did is he came to me and said, look, I want to know how long you intend to do this, because there will be a point in time when I want to go back to my life that I had before, which is windsurfing and hanging out in Switzerland on the ski slopes. And I said, I truly understand. And we talked about different scenarios. And the scenario that made sense was to build the company up a little further. And then once it reached a certain value, start soliciting offers and try to sell the company.
Look for a buyer.
Yep. And so one of the ways that I chose to do that, and by the way, he stood with me to the very end. So even through the earnout,
that's great.
He was there every day. And to this day, we're best of friends.
That's awesome.
But here's the thing, and this leads into my book. One of the things that I discovered almost by accident was what would happen if you were able to take your best clients, your absolute top greatest clients in your whole client base, and turn them into your greatest tech support and salespeople at the same time. Well, that's what I inadvertently did. And what ended up happening was that we asked a client to help us with another client who lived nearby. And they came back to us and said, if you have anybody else who needs my help, you just let me know. Well, that became the Time Slips Certified Consultant Program.
Oh, nice.
And at first, all we had to do was write a test. And if people passed the test, we'd call them certified. And if they called them certified, we can send them out to clients. And we did that for about 50, 60 people until we realized what a disaster we had just created. These people were completely unprepared to show up at a professional office.
Wow.
We just did not do any screening at all. And so we started to have lawsuits threatened, and we started to have a lot of angry customers, which is the first time ever that's ever happened. Usually our customers were totally in love with us. But I had to shut down the program and had to figure out what I did wrong. So I shut it down and I called up every person who was complaining and got a detailed overview of what happened when this consultant came to see them. What I did with that information is I completely rebuilt the program from scratch, and I completely changed the way we recruited people, tested them, and trained them. And that then expanded to 350 people. So now we had 350 people in every state in the country and some foreign countries representing us, selling our software, selling our support plans, and helping our clients. So our support costs dropped by 20%. And I inadvertently created our third largest sales channel in the whole company. I didn't even realize that was going to happen, but they wanted to sell our product. So we gave them a small discount, and now they're selling almost as much as our retail channel. So,
wow.
And without paying a penny. In fact, the opposite of paying a penny, they paid us every year to stay certified, which we did.
Gotta love that.
And in a matter of 18 months, we doubled the value of the company.
Wow.
And so
that's incredible.
I went to Neil and I said, Neil, now's the time. Let's figure out how to sell the company. The other part of it is my CFO asked me a very important question. He says, Mitch, when you started this company, it was just you and Neil and a little checking account. But now you're standing out there on the tightrope every month, and that tightrope is almost $800,000 a month high. That means every month you're risking your entire net worth just on whether this company can ship an update or whether or not God forbid the company burns down, or anything could happen. So that made me realize that, again, it might be time to consider selling the company or doing
Yeah.
something along those lines. So I started looking for buyers. I hired an agent to help me. Total waste of money. I ended up finding my own buyer. I ended up negotiating my own
Yeah,
deal.
it's better just when you want things done, do it yourself, right? Or when you want things done right, right? That's what they
Yeah.
say.
So we had two buyers come to the table at the same time. We created a Chinese auction environment. And in effect, we got a great price and we agreed to sell. So we did.
Nice.
Awesome.
That's
Yeah,
awesome.
it was a pretty awesome sell for you, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then, once you were done with that, I mean, as you progress, what'd you get into and what are you working on now?
Right. So one of the friends that I made throughout the time slips years was a guy named Chet Holmes. Chet was a very persistent salesperson who was trying to sell me advertising space in one of the magazines he represented. And, I got to know Chet real well. We became great friends. And over the years, we stayed in touch, very close friends. And one day, after I sold the company, I then came back to Boston. I then began investing in other companies as a venture capitalist. I then went to work for another VC, helping them with some of their portfolio companies. That was a lot like going to college for business MBA, because I ended up helping dozens and dozens of different companies in different spaces. And every one of them I was able to turn around. And these were the problem portfolio companies that VCs have. And so at that point, I got a call from Chet and he goes, "Look, I'm having trouble with my company. I need your help." So I dove in, helped Chet, and make a long story short, Chet made me president of the company after 5 months. And then we began negotiating with Tony Robbins. So it was Chet, myself, and Tony on the phone every Thursday night trying to figure out how to put this company together.
Wow. That's a pretty unique Thursday night phone call.
Yeah.
Yeah, and because both of those guys were in California, I was up sometimes till 1, 2 in the morning.
Right.
I didn't mind at all.
No.
Yeah.
And that's how I got to know Tony. And Tony, an incredible individual as he is, um, uh, he had no reason to respect me. I was nobody really,
Mm-hmm.
but he did, and he wanted me to be part of his business with Chet. And together, the three of us built Business Breakthroughs International.
That's awesome.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We grew that to about almost 30 million in revenue, and then Chet died. So Chet
Oh, wow.
contracted leukemia, and he passed away. And I lost my spirit was crushed. Chet was my
Yeah.
best friend,
Absolutely.
and so I told Tony it was time for me to take a leave of absence, to retire, to resign.
Wow.
And,
But I mean, that just shows you the power of relationships that you can, and how they play such a vital role. I mean, earlier, like you said, with the bank, the relationship that you had with the bank, got you kind of a second chance there. And the relationship with Chet brought you into something bigger than yourself and created more friendships. And I think that's a huge learning lesson there, is that the relationships that you build throughout life and through business is going to excel you much further than you could by yourself.
so true. That is so true.
Yeah.
Wow.
Absolutely. And then after that, you started with the book. We got a few more, a minute or so before we got to jump into the moments of truth. But can you just touch on that and what you did there?
Yeah. So I wasn't at an age where I wanted to retire, and I just love helping companies grow. But I realized after one of my clients asked me to build a certification program for him, that when I did that, I had something unique that not a lot of people knew about or knew how. So I started doing that for other clients as well, until finally I decided to take everything I knew and codify it in a book called Power Tribes. And the nice thing about Power Tribes is that it's a blueprint type of a book.
Mm-hmm.
You don't read it for fun. You read it because you want to build a company, and you want to build it rapidly, and you want to build it big. And so what ended up happening is that the Power Tribes book took on a life of its own. That became the Power Tribes program. And now I work with companies all over the world, helping them build certification programs for their best clients. And
That's so cool.
yeah. And I still help, I only take on 5 new clients a month. But I like to take on people who are not beginners. I take on people who've already have revenue, and
Right.
they just hit some form of a ceiling. It may come at 100,000 or 500,000, or even at 2.5 million. But I am the guy you call when you need to get through that next plateau.
That's great.
Incredible. That's awesome.
That is awesome.
Well, Mitch, we're going to jump into our Moments of Truth segment here. It's the same 7 questions we ask all our guests, and I'm going to kick it off with the first one here.
Sure.
Who is your success role model?
Well, I spent a lot of time with Tony Robbins, and I saw many dimensions of Tony's personality. But the thing I was most impressed with is his intelligence and his heart. So he would have to be my role model.
Awesome. What's your biggest success?
Well, my biggest financial success is Time Slips Corporation. It's not often that you receive checks for 5 million plus all at once. And that was, one of the things that I achieved at Time Slips. But my true success is in raising an incredible child, a 24-year-old daughter who still lives in Boston today, and to this day continues to pay dividends, if you will, bring me joy in every way.
That's awesome.
She is my biggest success.
Hey, that's great. So what does a typical day for you look like?
I have a routine every morning. I get up, I meditate, I go to the gym. I come back from the gym, I get myself cleaned up. I then do a little bit more meditation and reading. And then I start my business day around 11 a.m. every morning. I break for dinner, and I'm done. Now that I'm in Florida here, I'm done at about 5 or 6 o'clock, and I sit and I watch the sunset from my living room.
Oh, that's going to be great.
From my deck. And then I usually have a little dinner and an evening activity, whatever that might be. A date with a pretty girl locally, or maybe a rock band I go hang out with.
That's awesome.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Sounds like a great time.
Yeah.
Yep. What's your favorite quote?
Okay. Well, I think other people have said this before, but it has truly been the one quote that has stuck with me over many, many years. And it's by Steve Jobs. And I know a lot of people like his quotes, and I do too. And here's the quote that he gave at a college graduation. And here's the quote: "Your time is limited, so don't waste living it someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition."
I love that. That's really, really good. The part about not living someone else's life. That's great.
Parents want kids to go to college to become doctors, and they don't want to be doctors, but they go anyway. That's living somebody else's life.
That's exactly right. That's great.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm sure you heard the dog howling in the background here.
Oh, yeah.
But what are some of your hobbies?
I thought that was your next guest.
Yeah, he's waiting. He's waiting.
Yeah. Well, I have many hobbies in a sense, because I love so many different things. But my primary passion in life is my landscape photography. I'm a landscape photographer. I shoot the landscape at night. So I'm an astrophotographer as well. And I travel all over the world. And I mean all over the world, for the sole purpose of photography.
That's really cool.
That's got to be awesome.
Well, you could see my gallery at mitchrussotravels.com. And my next trip is to Myanmar, also known as Burma, which is near northern India and Bangladesh.
Oh, wow.
Very
Okay.
cool.
So you go all over.
All over.
Very cool.
Yeah.
What's the best business book that you've read?
Oh, you're going to laugh if I tell you this. First of all, the latest business book I read is called Flip the Script by Oren Klaff.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved it. I loved every word, every page, every minute of reading it. But the greatest business book I ever read isn't a business book at all. It's called The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho.
Great book. Fantastic book.
Yes.
I've never read that.
I would suggest reading it. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
The last question here: if there's one key piece of advice you could leave our listeners with about achieving success, what do you think it would be?
Well, I advise a lot of people, typically, who reached a point where they don't know what else to do. And one of the things I admire about my clients is that they never gave up, and they don't give up. And the advice that I have is that when you give up, that's when you failed. But while you're still in the game, anything is possible. So I would look at a pivot before I would look at shutting anything down. And every time in my life, I didn't tell you the pivot story about time slips, but there was one. And what I found is that in many great businesses do not take a straight line path to success. It's usually all over the place.
Oh, that's very true.
Yeah, that's good.
So, Mitch, how can our listeners get in contact with you? I know you shouted out your website for your photography, but if you go over that again, how can they get in contact with you and find your book?
Sure.
Or books.
Books, yeah.
Right. Basically, you go to Amazon and you can look for The Invisible Organization or Power Tribes. Or if you go to powertribesbook.com, you can get the book and a course that comes free with the book. And if anyone wants to get a hold of me, you can go to mitchrusso.com. Or you could write me directly at mitch@mitchrusso.com.
Love it.
Awesome. So, guys, make sure you grab a copy of his book and get some learning done from Mitch. And also, don't forget to subscribe to the show so that you're not missing any of our daily episodes. And join us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/wealthjunkies. Mitch, we appreciate you being on the show today.
My pleasure. That was a ton of value. We really appreciate everything. Your story is incredible.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. We'll see everybody tomorrow.